Everything is a reduction of a single state of consciousness. This is a fact. This is what, for example, all the quantum physicists and the biochemists and the philosophers are attempting to do, is find an ultimate singularity or truth. It should be obvious to anyone in a state of real so-called analysis of consciousness to see that a unified force field is the same as God. There would ultimately be no difference in the idea of a unification, okay, of apparent objectivity to a singularity that would obviously constitute God. Remember that in this state of consciousness, everything is reduced, historically in that sense. Paul reduces Jesus, doesn't he? Of course. Of course. Augustinian ideas reduce Neoplatoism. Of course, inevitably. Okay? Newton, for example, an offspring of Aristotle, who reduced Plato. Sure, of course. Look right at it. Okay. There is finally no difference in the notion of Newtonian logic or Newtonian science than in, say, objective deification. They're the same thing. They're the same idea. Do you see that? The unity can be established outside of you. Obviously, then, the next step beyond that would be for science to establish what? First, the idea of relativity, which is an incredible expose of consciousness. It's fun historically to look at how it occurred to Einstein, how it came about, and how it really, the idea of relativity involved what could be termed a mystical experience. That's a nice thing to look at. And of course it's true. It did. Do you have an idea what the new young modern minds in 2 generations since Einstein really are capable of constructing in their own mind? Try to get a hold of this if you can. You go and sit with a young group sometimes that's really in states of thinking now, and this we're only talking about 60, 70, 80 years here. I'm just going to point out the obvious so-called evolution of the consciousness. Okay. This occurred with me in a very high nature. I remember very well, I was about 12 years old, maybe younger, and I suddenly was presented with a pop version of the notion of relativity. And I'll never forget the experience that I had when I looked at it. There was a deep intuition of me that caused a flourish of energy in my head where I was automatically able to conceive of how completely rational the notion of relativity is. The problem that my mind subsequently had with that idea were to sort out the limited definitions that were applied in applications of attempts to communicate to me what relativity were. If you want to see a young mind work today, watch them take, for example, the negativism of Schopenhauer, shake it out in about 2 minutes and come up with the truth of it. Real easy. The young minds are doing that. They may do it in the nature of an expression of Star Wars or Darth Vader or whatever his name is, but they do it in their mind. Do you see what I'm saying to you? They'll take who else? Well, a beautiful divine notion of Spinoza and refine it in a single sentence in Course in Miracles and take it right up to its truth. You see what happens with those minds? They are not reducing themselves to some sort of qualitative analysis of fracturedism. They put together. And this is really what we're trying to bring about in your mind. Do you see that? Can you see what we're trying to do? Finally, the notion of Augustinian philosophy or Newtonian physics that is highly regarded in a certain sagacity of limitation, for example, with the Pope, who is a master of phenomenology, which is a high statement that there can be objective phenomena outside the single realization of selfness. Okay? The Pope will take it right straight up to the point of refusing to recognize he is in fact instigating the phenomena. Do you see that? Of course, the whole basis of quantum thinking, of Course in Miracles, of absolute thought without object, of subjectivity, is the notion of nomina, or that you are involved in any equation in regard to your thinking. Holy mackerel, how beautiful. We can teach that, but we must teach it through a process of recognition that the occurrence is in fact a form of expose. All limited consciousness is willing to acknowledge the occurrence of an expansion or realization, generally speaking, as to music, as to art, as to philosophy, as to science, as to religion. But the inevitable tendency reduces it to a form of duality simply because the consciousness is not capable of a notion of what you might term non-objective existentialism. Okay? There is no truer statement in the universe than cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But once you've arrived at that inevitable conclusion, the question continues to arise, but who am I? Whence comes this notion of my existence? Wow, what an occurrence. Yes. Finally, it comes more down to the necessity for consciousness to verify itself. All creation finally is unity verification, or the extension of a total idea. How do you express that? This is in Course in Miracles. Everybody finally only creates their own notion of themselves. Don't you see that? It falls into a limited framework of consciousness simply because they have identified themselves as separate from the single unity. Wow. What's more Newtonian than that idea? And what is more unifying than the idea of quantum, or the idea of a single force or congruity that finally has to arrive at the incredible delineation that the universe is only consciousness. That's a simplistic thing, finally, because truth is extremely simple. It's the notion that truth has moving parts or is somehow devious that causes all of your concern. The requirement in coming to know that involved in the actual process is one of non-subtraction of the self in the relationship to everything that is apparently outside of him. This is the process that we teach, which is nothing more than we started out with in the conversation in A Course in Miracles, where we attempt to teach the consciousness to look at what is apparently objective and do not establish its reality, but rather ask it what it is. This disassociates you from your own memory patterns in association with duality. It's really what happens. The problem that Brother Albert Einstein had with arriving at the conclusion of a unified force field was only his inability to carry the concept of it to the inclusion of his own idea about it. He ended up with the inevitable apparent notion that God is rolling dice, and this is his expression. He said, I can't believe that God rolls dice. Obviously, if there is such a thing as true objectivity, there is an element of chance that has to be involved. It would be inevitable, because there is no basic order in the concept of the apparent reality. You see? It causes futurizing automatically. It cannot not. Is that a little muddy? That thought. My mind is coming in too fast. I express that. Well, we may express it to you. It is impossible for you to have an original thought. You're thinking in the past tense. And any projection you do in a time-space sequencing must involve your previous connotations of yourself. You construct your future, in other words, based on your past, obviously.
Who does it?
The consciousness, you individually, the universe.
I'll answer a couple questions.
Do you have your tape on?
Yes.
You came here prepared to ask me a couple of questions. I have my tape on. Speaking to us now is Brother Andrew, who occasionally may appear to be some sort of antagonist, but in a very high sense presents Socratic ideas, which are subsequently discussed in unlimited frameworks. Yes.
Makes it a minute of the tape. I've heard of two situations similar. In one case, a person was hypnotized, given the suggestion that he, a signal, take off his shoe and put it on top of a fireplace mantle. And this happened.
Yes.
Just suddenly he took off his shoe, put it on top of the fireplace.
Shall I answer that one for you first?
Not yet. And then he was asked why he did it. And he said he made up an excuse, he made up a reason to explain his behavior, which he didn't even understand himself.
Isn't that nice?
And his excuse was his foot was warm and he wanted to take his shoe off.
Yes.
And he put it on the mantle because he wanted to be sure that he knew where it was.
Whatever. We're looking at the idea that he had to justify the action.
Yes.
That's the whole dilemma.
My question pertains
You just answered it, but go ahead.
our behavior that you're attributing to us,
Mm-hmm.
that we may not be consciously responsible.
You are not consciously, but ultimately you're responsible for your behavior and do in fact justify it in some regard. This is the whole basis of what I teach.
But it's unconscious.
Who cares? You've forgotten God. What you can call the consciousness is limited to your idea about yourself and subsequently makes you stay within the framework. That's why I teach that it is indeed a transformative occurrence. You listen to what I'm saying. I'm trying to change your mindset in this regard. Obviously, every action must be justified or the action would not occur. The whole basis of what we teach is non-motivated action. Okay, listen to me. I want to say this one other way for you. Obviously, the hypnotist was conveying to the other limited state of consciousness first a basic recognition of objectivity. Okay, the consciousness hypnotized did not say to the hypnotist, "What's a shoe?" I asked you to ask the hypnotist, "What's a shoe?" Do you see? Well, look at it. Obviously, the hypnotist and the one hypnotized shared a limited concept of the ability to take off a shoe composed in some sort of relationship of energy that apparently constituted a body. All of it is objective thinking and limited. All that you presented to me was limited. I can take it and move it up into a framework of truth for you. The justification of the necessity to remove the shoe is the justification of self-identity. It will inevitably occur within the state of consciousness. It cannot not.
My non-antagonistic question is, how can we do the things that you're asking us to do when we don't even know the reasons why we're doing the things that we're doing?
Ah, but you have a perfect purpose. You have constructed an idea of unity in your head and express it.
But I didn't do it consciously.
Of course not, because consciously you deny it. You don't appear to, but in the state of limited consciousness, obviously you are denying singularity. That's a fact. Now you may say to me, I choose not to believe I am denying it, and I'm perfectly willing to go along with the idea that you have not reached a metamorphic position in your so-called transformation where you have access to a unified form of thinking. Okay. Okay. All I say to you then is, since you have constructed it in your mind, you obviously have the capacity to bring it about. I would suggest that you do so. If you are determined to remain within a limited framework of your consciousness, we are now directly involved with what we teach, obviously. Because the necessity for you to take off the shoe and put on the shoe is precisely why you're here. Which is nothing more than a limited self-identification. What I say to you then in an attempt to stir you from this is to inform you with certainty that there literally is nothing outside of your thoughts about it. If you were to look at it in that way, Brother Andrew, I would say to you, everything that you think there is all that there is. And there is nothing but that. This will cause you deep concern because you are determined that there is a form of discrete thinking that is occurring outside of your frame, which is exactly what Newtonian physics maintains. The quantumist has arrived at the incredible, obvious conclusion that there is no discernment between energies, that they're all finally the same thing. The next and only final step that can be made is that they are finally you. No matter how you constitute, it doesn't make a poop how you constitute yourself. Don't you see that? Do you see that, Brother Andrew? There is nothing to compare you with. You insist on comparing yourself with things that are apparently outside of you. Jesus would teach in Course in Miracles, and it's taught Buddha. Who taught it more emphatically than Buddha? Buddha is reduced automatically. Christ reduces to Christianity. Did I say that? Huh? Of course. Does Plato reduce to Aristotle? It goes on and on and on. Everything is always a reduction. But finally, it reduces only to you.
How does Buddha reduce?
In any attempts to define him, it's automatic reduction.
Buddha was the only one that said, don't even mention the word God.
Of course. So
as soon as you do, you've stepped out of your sight.
Exactly right. So everybody mentions him and reduces. That's just exactly what I said. Thank you. Yes. The idea, the next step, or the idea of the transformation occurrence which occurred with Jesus Christ in the establishment of the capacity of the consciousness to evolve, which is what Christianity is and all it is, was automatically reduced and turned out to be a process of death to find life, which has no real reality. This is all in Course in Miracles in the text, beautifully expressed. You see? You finally do not die to live. You never die. It's your acknowledgement of the idea of limitation that's sustaining you in this state. Brother Andrew, you're in a state of absolute objection to the idea of eternity because it involves time for you. It cannot not involve time. If I say to you, you're going to sit there forever and ever, you refute me by standing up and walking and sitting in another chair. You understood me, good. I see the way your mind is working. We put onto the tape last week, it's a beautiful notion. Your mind is working obviously only in the past tense. Everything that's constructed in you is based on what apparently has already occurred. If you do that, if you really look at it, you're not really thinking about now, you're only thinking about a moment ago. And obviously you can't think about next week or next month when I put this on the tape. What is expressed in Course in Miracles and is on the tape is that everyone on Earth's mind is actually blank. Look at it. So we attempt to bring you into the now, which is really what eternity is. Okay? Watch a human being come together in a group with an establishment and limitation and attempt to communicate. They will succeed only on a very limited level, but that's really all they ask for. I don't require that you understand me totally, but it would certainly be nice if we would not nuke each other. That we would not kill each other, or that we could get together and have a little relationship here. Or that we could certainly share a lot of common things until we may have our demise, until we die, you see. So, in reality, there is absolutely no communication occurring here except when it is transcendent. Now, one of the high forms of communication is if you go to the Chicago Symphony tonight, and 1,000 people sit in an auditorium and share an impulse of energy, okay, a conglomeration of rhythms or patterns of sounds, of the notions of the chromatic scale, they will enter into a form of symbiosis of a very high nature. That's what communication is. Communication ultimately has nothing to do with the definition of it. If there's one thing that Jesus teaches in Course in Miracles, is that experience can be unified, or that God is experiential. That's the whole basis of the Course. And can be shared, because we have an absolute common denominator of reality. To take that one step further, Brother Andrew, it would be very nice if I could show you that, say I go like this. It has absolutely no significance at all. Somewhere along the line, you were determined in your mind at that moment to give me a cause and effect relationship in regard to what you considered me to be. It's absolutely inevitable. The basis of Zen, or a cone as it's called, I believe, is to bring about a shift in your consciousness where you no longer are sequential in your thinking. You see that? Okay. See, you go, wow, what's he doing that for? Why are you doing that? Don't tell me you don't have a reason for doing it. You're manipulating me. At the very most, you try to wake me up. Yeah.
Your analogy of people sitting in a symphony and sharing a transcendental consciousness is very apt and appropriate.
Yeah.
But as soon as you go to open your mouth and talk about it, you've entered into duality.
Sure.
You're attempting to solve the problem at the level of the problem, and it can never be done that way.
Sure, I know. I agree. Therefore, you're condemned to hell forever.
No.
Well, okay.
No.
But see, then as soon as you say no, then you allow for my insinuation of energy into you and the sharing of
I
the
allow for that.
Okay.
But as soon as you open your mouth, you're off the mark.
Yeah, but I can't extend without
I know you can.
I can't
because
extend
that's
without
how
an
you
idea.
generate your Shakti.
Sure, of course. That's the highest form you can do. That's what God does. Of course, you're right on the mark. God generates Shakti by extension of a true idea, if you want to look at it that way. Oh, yeah, certainly. But remember, only you can do it. The tendency is to think that somehow Except Jesus calls in Course in Miracles an absolute relationship of brotherhood that is inevitable in consciousness. The idea of establishment in time implies somehow that there can be one consciousness that has arrived at a particular point within the framework that seems to be more advanced. I am absolutely, totally aware in my awakening that there are no degrees in consciousness, that there genuinely are not hierarchies of consciousness. The idea of a hierarchy or the establishment of planes of consciousness always occurs in the limited state as it attempts to identify singularity. And in that process, it has a validity because there's an obviously application of the possibility of a revolution or an involvement to a higher state, which is contained in the basic necessity to overcome. You can't do it any other way. That is not practiced at what seems to be a lower level. Obviously, a rhinoceros does not construct ideas of future and all that. Since you have done it in your own state, okay, the total realization that that can come about in you is a very, very necessary element. There could be, for example, no ideas, finally, of what you would call quantum physics or relativity without the fundamental notion of Newtonianism. You have to have a concept of the possibility of objectivity. That's a form of evolution. Sure. And that all occurs really within your own framework of thinking, if you care to look at it. There's certain ideas involved in the incredible notion of non-discretion. There's a paradox that is contained in specialness for me to convey to you the idea that you are totally unique and special, okay? But not in regard to anything separate from you. The idea that you are unique and special is contained in all of your fundamental existentialism. It's absolutely inevitable. It's the only single thing that you can know is that I am I. And we're back to that once again. Accepting the notion that it is transcendental or theosophical, okay, or Gnostic is a very major step. As Jesus would teach, of course, all ideas of love are efforts to communicate. Finally, all communication is only self-identity, or an attempt to identify self. Limitedness can never convey. Jesus would teach it projects rather than extends. Yes. Yes. It projects from it its concept of itself. This is what the fracturedism is. Okay. The idea that is projected from the consciousness contains the whole. That is, it contains the idea of positive, negative, or the idea of comparison or conception. What we attempt to do in A Course in Miracles, or in teaching a form of transformation, is to cause you to think without discretion, really, basically. That's what the atonement is. In Course, it's taught as the limited state of consciousness in its attempts to perpetuate itself has established in its own karma memory patterns of resistance in order to sustain consciousness, or defiance, or self-regulation, or limitation inevitably results in grievance, or the idea that there is a form outside of you that could cause fear or attack and cause concern to you as a consciousness. The whole basis of your karma, of your memory, in the schismed universe of duality is obviously based on self-subsistence and limitation. That isn't hard. Okay. Jesus in Course says all of your thinking is what? Post-schism. That is, you think in a manner that involves a continual breaking down in the limitation of your consciousness. Yes, it does. Of course. Of course. But if you stop and look at it, there's contained in your fabric the idea of unity. Obviously, it's necessary that you participate in that equation. Wow. Wow. Did you look at the chaos out there as the individual consciousnesses attempt to sustain their own identities? Wow. That's an amazing thing. No wonder it's chaotic. All of them are indeed unique in their historic patterns. Wow. There is not one single fingerprint that's the same as any other fingerprint. You know, that's a nice way to look at it if you want. And there's billions of them. And they keep breaking down and breaking down. Survival of the fittest, in reality, is simply survival of the limited state at that moment of its own individual consciousness. Limitation always divides. Wow. There's 846 species of beetles within a 1 square mile in the Brazilian jungle. Holy mackerel.
Are you saying that eventually if I want such thing, I would become 2 or more of these individuals? Say, you're breaking down.
Well, no, but what you have done in your basic concept or idea right there is broken yourself down from this table. You obviously consider this table to be separate from you, don't you? Huh? Why? What is that table? Now you're going to answer me by looking into your mind in a previous construction and informing me what that table is. If I keep asking you questions, you're screwed. You'll come down, there's no way you can tell me what that table is. You have absolutely no idea what it is in reality. Try it if you want. These are just exercises this is in the workbook of Course in Miracles, exactly what occurs. We can sit here forever. You never will be able to find, you'll break it down and you keep breaking it down and you keep breaking it down and you arrive at the molecules and then you'll get into other sessions of it in your mind. Okay? Don't you see? Ultimately, what you do is give up and allow it to be a table and utilize it in your limited consciousness. This is what the fabric of society really is. The use of objectivity and limitation is all that we really do here. Then we'll battle each other over our ideas of what this table is. I'm very capable of killing you over my insistence that this is a particular table, or the possession of the table since it's outside of me and I want to hold on to it. The idea of scarcity is involved in that.
But I can see it, but I can't tell you what I'm seeing.
Yes.
But I am experiencing something there.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I can't communicate.
No.
Now, does that mean I'm still kind of off the mark?
Well, you're off the mark automatically, but that's okay. Really, what you have begun to do then is what? Examine your own projections or your own thoughts, which is a very necessary part of the awakening process. That's why I would teach you to look at the table and say, What is it? When you come into a framework of unifying in thinking, you may very well look at that table and see it as the Last Supper table, for example. What? You will see it as anything that you have constructed in your mind. The whole basic tenet of what we think, and you must get this, is conception always precedes perception. It's absolutely inevitable. Will you grant me that?
That means that I see the table, that I think of the table before I see it.
Must. Must. Otherwise, what's the difference between Newtonian thinking? You see? You're right, you're sitting right on what I just talked about.
And I have the fear before the accident.
You have the need to protect your own identity and your own framework of consciousness, of course. Of course. You are only what you are. Now, as you come out with that, as you begin to think, you construct all this variety and sustain your limited consciousness through variety rather than unity. Yes, it will never work. The dilemma of Adam having to name the animals was incredible. He ends up with a continual breakdown of species. Why? Because he's got himself separate from it. And he'll keep breaking it down and breaking it down. It's inevitable. Good morning, brother.
So when it comes to the giraffe, he says me, brother. I mean, he says this is me and this is me.
Yes, the way you finally teach it, however, would be simply the acceptance of your own thoughts. This is what we would teach it in Course in Miracles. If there is only your thought about something, in other words, if you are the conceptor of the universe, you are a creator. I assure you this is true. Okay. Since you are in duality and self-protection, you have established and delineated in your own consciousness relative states in ideas about what constitutes your makeup. Okay. We would teach it in Course in Miracles. It is impossible for you to have a thought that will ever leave you. Here's the whole dilemma of guilt. If you are attempting to establish yourself in limitation, and obviously you succeed in doing it, you have by nature the necessity to order your thoughts. You cannot not do it. You automatically reject or sustain some thoughts apparently in your consciousness. Now, in a very real sense, this is in the New Testament. This is what Jesus tries to teach. In a very real sense, I'm sorry, if you think of murderer, you are the murderer. If you think of murder, it's absolutely inevitable. You don't want to look at that. I know that you don't want to look at that. You do not want to be responsible for your own thinking, but you are. You will do everything but be responsible for it. Why? Because you've constructed death, and you don't want to be responsible for death. You see? Can you see this? One death is all death. If one thing dies, everything dies. Look at it. Death is limitation.
Could you explain what you meant before when you said death defines life?
That death defines it?
No, death, you use the term death defines life.
That's what we live in here. Death defines life. Yeah.
Expand on what you mean by that.
That means that you are basing your consciousness on the concept that there is an annihilation or a termination. Anywhere you look on earth, you have constructed a form of cyclicalness or something that evolves. Really, it's an establishment of time and space that ultimately leads to an apparent termination. There's expressions that are not acceptable in Course in Miracles, like anything that is not forever is not real. Tell me something that is forever. You can't. You can't. You'll attempt a concept of God. You'll say to me, well, God is eternal. But there can be no eternity outside your idea about it. What am I saying to you? God is your idea. Death is your idea. Look at it. Tell me about God. Tell me about truth. Tell me what truth is. You can't. You can only be it. The notion that you can have ideas is a very strange thing. Who are you then? What do you have? You have ideas about things, you're simply separated. Can't you see that you are the idea?
Am I everything that I experience?
Good. Only. Only. Amen. You don't like that, though. You would rather only have, you can't tell the difference finally between pleasure and pain, but you keep trying. There's the concept in the human mind of continuity, as we just spoke of, is a high necessity to the coming about of the realization of singularity. It occurs dramatically in the notion of reincarnation. The idea of a continuing consciousness then has great validity. The problem with reincarnation is the sense of limitation involved in the obvious notions of separateness in the memory pattern. That is to say, you were nothing specific in the past, but everything in your own relationship of consciousness. I used to try to express that in the definition of the passion of the crucifixion, where you were no more Peter than you were the Roman soldier. Everything is your idea about it. Now, if you have a mystical experience in reincarnation where you speak fluid Sanskrit, of course, I have already allowed you that the configuration of your consciousness genetically not only contains all possibilities, but contains all previous occurrences in the whole schism. It's only your dream, brother.
Well, that's why we read somewhere that eventually evidence could be found that would validate Atlantis, because this would be generated.
I'll validate it for you. It's absolutely true. What about it?
Just because you said it's true, you want to be believed.
Sure. And it is.
But a geologist today could not find any evidence for it.
For who cares?
Well, I mean, could you say that it's just as possible for people living on the other side of the moon or something?
Sure, but I'd have to take it up a step for you then, and you may start with that premise. But if you take that up just one step in your thinking, remember finally that history is not objective. History is not an occurrence of separate, specific things. That's just in your mind that it is. What is history finally, except what you think it is? Or what you arrive at in aggregate with your people at a particular time.
So what I'm saying is it possible that my great-grandfather of mine wrote a letter on June 6th of 1889? Did this occur or did it not?
It occurred. It had to occur. You just expressed it.
Yeah, but suppose I said that I took a trip yesterday to a museum.
I would be the last one to deny it. What about it? What good is that going to do you except that you expand to the realization that you're responsible for everything you say? You have already established in your mind the idea that truth is relative. I tell you that that is not so. You sit within a framework of limitation and pretend that actions that you took had more validity than other actions. They don't. Okay, your great-grandfather was a horse thief and was hanged by his neck. You may not particularly like to think about that, and you may rather present him as a picture of a loving father. Be my guest, brother.
So what in truth was he? Was he really in truth a horse?
He's whatever you decided that he was, and nothing else. Good grief. How could he be anything else but your idea about him? We can arrive at the conclusion that Hitler was an evil man. And you'll get some people after 50 years who say he wasn't so bad. Isn't that funny? Everybody just keeps rewriting history. Don't you see that? History is always based on expedience of consciousness, for goodness sake. We'll rewrite it anytime you want to. What's nice to see occur in the consciousnesses is the taking of the allegory of duality, which really is nothing but what the process of awakening is, and having it reconstructed in your mind to a single truth. What is it you're trying to prove when you ask these questions but yourself? In limitation. I'll accept anything that you say to me. It's time that your mind began to look at the occurrence of a fairy tale as having the reality of revelation contained within it. What's more mystical than the Battle of Waterloo? Come on. It's what you make it in your mind. Quite literally, what we ask you to do, say in the workbook of Course in Miracles, okay, is to free yourself from your own limited configurations. And as that begins to occur in you, it's a very joyous, it can be an extremely joyous and happy and incredible occurrence because it is freedom. It begins basically with the fundamental idea that somewhere within the framework that you are conceiving of yourself, there is contained a unity or a truth or a singularity. This is the tacit acknowledgement of duality. It is inevitable that the earth would not be here had it not somewhere within a framework, however limited, constructed the conception of God, or of truth, or of wholeness. Okay. The next step that you will attempt to teach is that since it cannot be found here, to gain the knowledge must be a form of transformation, or a changing of the mind, or an enlightenment, or an aha experience, or a resurrection, or a genius definition, or a symphony, or a beautiful poem, or anything that brings about a shift in your basic awareness of your relationship with what apparently is outside of you. This is the basis of everything that I teach. We have reached very nicely in this configuration sociologically with the acknowledgement that gaining truth could in fact be transformative. It has always been known among esoteric circles. The whole idea of the ancient wisdom, the whole basic fundamental concept of the religion Christianity is based on knowledge of God being gained by a transformative occurrence or a resurrection. That is in all literature, obviously. It insinuates every possibility of the conception of man in duality. Okay. Yes. Yes. So, if we are going to teach it, the ability that is inherent in the individual consciousness to conceive of itself as whole must be at least an intellectual presumption. If you come into a group, you must somehow assume, and do at some level, that you are there for what you might call a legitimate purpose, to come to know who you are. Okay. As I indicated just before we started this tape, if you will look at this basket, and this is really what's occurring in your minds now, and instead of saying, you are a basket, you say, what are you? Don't tell it what it is. Ask it what it is. Do you see how simple that is? Obviously, if you tell it what it is, it simply becomes a configuration in your own state of memory or limited consciousness. There is a very beautiful passage in one of the first 20 lessons in Course in Miracles where the sentence reads something like this: I can get you to grant that the past is not now. Okay? So it's impossible for you to think about it in reality. And that the future is not now, and it's really impossible for you to construct it. So quite literally, moment by moment, on the planet Earth, everybody's minds are literally blank. They are not thinking of anything. You see? All they do is construct the past as they have observed it, which is not now, and project it out into the future. It's a beautiful way to look at it. So we have people walking around, and nobody, quite literally, okay, is really thinking at all. The upshot of that, or the actual reality of that, is that it is absolutely impossible for there to be any form of communication in the chaos. Why? Because everybody is simply facing what they see on their own individual concepts on the past. It has no reality. Uh-oh, now we're into what we really have to say about this. Quite obviously, if we have granted that there is a single source, you and I individually and in consort with all other consciousnesses must ultimately share that reality. And that's what we attempt to bring about in brotherhood. That's all. The Course in Miracles calls it love. It has obviously nothing to do with love or attempts at communication that are fostered here in the duality, in the chaos. It couldn't. Because love does not involve, finally, perception. Perception is always distinguishing. Okay? This would be taught in Course in Miracles, as it is impossible for you to have a neutral thought. Try to. Can't. Do you see? It's impossible not to take sides in perception, because perception or conception of limited self is based on taking sides. And subsequently, you have the incredible dilemma of literally rejecting or attempting to reject some of your own discernments. High thought coming. An idea can never leave its source. Its reality is only contained in the whole, which is another way of saying that two things cannot know each other. Obviously, because two-ness is constructed on duality. So you have the apparent species Homo sapien sitting in a state of duality in a virtual attempt to sort out his own fracturedism or his own consciousness and choose in preference things to sustain his limited consciousness. Jesus, of course, tries to express it this way. Everything around you is an effect of your thought and has no reality because your thought of it has no reality. Wow. One of the nice ways to come to know that is to at least acknowledge that if there is nothing outside of you, it can only be your thoughts that are affecting you. And that's a nice way to look. Obviously, that's true. Only your idea about something or how you have constructed it within your own memory or karma framework gives it any apparent validity at all. Since the whole notion of limited consciousness is based on, again, Course in Miracles calls it attack or defend. Okay? You might look at it as a limited state of consciousness where there is apparently outside of you something that could affect you without your acquiescence to it, is what causes all pain and greed and murder and all the other things that go with it. And obviously this is so. We can teach you, and you have come to learn, that you are being affected by your own ideas about things. And that's very nice. Finally, the universe is only an idea. If the idea is limited, obviously it is not universal. So that finally the thinker cannot stand separate from the thought. As long as you believe in your limited state of consciousness through constructed limitation that the thinker can be separate from his thought, you will maintain space-time. You cannot not do it. The whole basis of the idea that you can stand outside of your own thought is what has created space. If I stand here in front of you in a limited state and say, I am Theodore everybody, that is a pole over there. I have obviously constructed what? A space between myself and the pole, and a time that would be involved for me to move from this space to that space. Okay. Now, if my idea about that pole is finally only a configuration in my own consciousness, it in fact has never left my thought about it. And this is high truth. Now, in order to come to that, I may look at the pole, and this can be practiced, and this is what Course in Miracles attempts to to bring about in the workbook, in the first 50 lessons. Look at the pole and say to the pole, not, you are a pole, okay, but as the first lesson in course teaches, I don't know what you are. Wow, look what happened. I don't know what anything is. Wow, look what happened. Okay. What's the next step? You look at the pole, you say to the pole, what are you? Okay. What does this do then within your own framework of consciousness? And this could really be practiced. It makes you, for that moment, come into the idea that you are extending a thought at that moment, not based on your previous recognition of it. What did you begin to do? You began to think. Thinking on earth has absolutely nothing to do with really thinking. This is all, of course, in Miracles in the first 50 lessons. That's a little disconcerting. And people who insist on grounding themselves to limited consciousnesses will look at me and say, well, that may be very true. But when my mind begins to do that, I become frightened. Because I am losing my identity. If this is not a lamp, I've got a very serious problem. You see? Yet I stand in front of you and say, this is not a lamp. If I ask you to define it for me, you will look at it and proceed to break it up into parts in order to what? Authenticate yourself in pieces. Right? It is amazing how your mind works. Now, this group obviously is coming into a very high state of what you might call aggregate consciousnesses. What would brotherhood be, finally, or communion, but the acknowledgement, first, of a singleness of truth? That is to say, altruistically, truth is true and nothing else is true, which belies the possibility of relativity or actual separate relationships within a true framework of consciousness. Okay. That then can cause us to what? Flow within our own memory patterns. Okay. Remember that since limited consciousness, I'm going to try it this way for you, is based in space-time on historic schism, it is necessary that you come to know that all of your thoughts in duality are in fact based on limitedness. Religiously, it's called evilness, or the fall. Okay? What we are really doing with your mind is causing you, because you contain what you might term the genetic capability, okay, to conceive of truth or God. Obviously, you can do that since you have done it. To bring you to the realization that since everything is finally only your thought about it, you must literally be the truth, or God. You cannot not be. Which is another way of saying you can't stand separate from your own ideas. This is the whole basis of the attempt in space-time at Christhood, or guruship, or the establishment of an apparent entity who has gone through a transformative occurrence and can convey through energy or ideas or by whatever means a form whereby you individually in your consciousness can come to know that truth. Okay. Taught at its highest level, okay, in consummation, there must be an acknowledgement on the individual consciousness's part that it is in fact truth unto itself. That has always been taught. Course in Miracles says emphatically, this is a course in knowing yourself. It couldn't possibly be anything else but that. And everybody nods their head, and know thyself is one of the fun, but it's much deeper than that. You must know yourself because there is literally nothing else that you can know. Wow. Wow. The presentation in the workbook, of Course in Miracles, with the immediate inevitability of that realization, places everyone in a high state of denial before they even begin. You can't even open it up, and you have a problem. If you start out with some of the basic things are nice to look at. Lesson 8. The past is not here. When you think about the past or anticipate the future, your mind is actually blank. What I just said. 14. Let me see somebody gobble this one up. You ready? The world you see has nothing to do with reality. It is of your own making, and it does not exist. That's a nice place to start, huh? Starts out very nicely. Everything you see is the result of your thoughts. No exceptions. No idle thoughts. A neutral thought is impossible. Listen, 19. Biggie. Cause and effect are never separated. Thinking and its results are simultaneous. Holy mackerel. It is a fact that there are no private thoughts. Oh, come now. Oh, come on. Somewhere along the line, I'm entitled to a little privacy here. Listen to me. You are entitled to total privacy. And in fact, that's all that God has is total privacy. Don't you see that? You're all able to look very much at that. Since there is nothing outside of you, you are, of course, totally private. What is more personal than God? What have you done with your own ideas to cause something to be outside of you that could subsequently harm you, or cause you concern, or bring about friction in you? There is no reality in combat or friction. There couldn't be. It's not possible. Wow. I ought to begin to teach this. When you see separate things, you are not really seeing it at all. That's lovely. I'm throwing in lesson 23 because nobody wants to really look at it. The only way out of fear is to give up attack and defense. Resist not evil. Do not participate in the chaos of your own limited projection. Wow. Wow. Really. I wrote some strange things down this morning. Oh, I had some song titles. I don't know why. It's a digression. There's no assurance without occurrence. That's a dandy. That is, if you don't undergo a process, you can never be sure of anything. There'll always be an element. That's why you can always tell an awakening consciousness or when it's awake. You may not be able to know what he's sure about, but you can see that he's very sure about whatever it is that you're not sure that he's sure about. That's a lovely definition. This one is for Nikki. Try not to smile on your own denial. That's a dandy. Somehow we admit that we're denying and kind of take satisfaction in our own denial. Really, that doesn't bring about anything. This one was designed for Nikki, too. It's a definition of tantric yoga. Finding lasting peace through a lasting peace. Excuse me. told me that one. You put that as a bumper sticker, tantric yoga. Bless her. Wow, that's true. Hey, wow. We'll come back in a minute. Thank you. The acknowledgement that this transformation is going on in you, okay, can bring about an incredible serenity and peace. Because as you refine your own fractured past through recollection of your own perfection, you allow everything that apparently is occurring outside of you to be as it is, without attempting to ascertain its historic frame of reference. You detach from it. Isn't that lovely to be able to do that? Each time that you do that, when you do not apply in consciousness specific cause and effect relationships, there occurs in your own energy relationship a pitching up or a raising of the energy. This is really what we attempt to teach is happening to you. Your mind will then begin to reconfigurate incredible occurrences that have happened in your past associations, quite literally. You will begin to see them in a new focus or a new frame of reference where they come together in finally an incredible single acknowledgement that the whole purpose of your state of consciousness was the metamorphosis that is now occurring in you. Is that beautiful? You then may want to study it in books, like you may want to quickly get a comparison between the I Ching and the genetic code. You may find a thrill in seeing that the helix in the genetic code is the same as the symbol of the I Ching, or the total potential of the universe. You go, oh my. Then as the shift continues to occur in you, you look about and you'll see in your mind incredible connections of color and sound and thought, or better expressed, art and poetry and literature will all come together in the singleness of the very, very obvious, incredible consciousness allegory of space-time. It's lovely. You'll take all of the fairy tales and translate them, not through a process of intellectualizing them, but rather a high form of iconism or symbolism into the reality that they are to demonstrate to you the occurrence of your own transformation. You will find in this process that your mind begins then to what? Do it with everything. So that when we look at this basket, instead of saying, you are a basket, or the next step, what are you? You look at the basket and say, I know in truth that you represent me in truth. And by my realization of your wholeness, I see myself as whole. What do we finally teach you then to do? Reject everything you apparently think is real in order to see that finally only you are reality. And this is what we're trying to do now in this process. As this occurrence reaches maturity in you, you may well experience what apparently is conflict. remember, in your attempt to stand aside from your own limited ideas, okay, you will be in denial and finally defiance of the constructs of the earth. From a religious standpoint, each consciousness unto itself practices on an apparent moment-by-moment basis the denial of its own true self and establishes in limitations, okay, outside of itself constructs in order to sustain through memory its own limitation. The real problem that you have individually in consciousness is that you have conceived of truth and harmony and truth and love and God, and are not yet in a state to recognize that it is in fact you. Perhaps the way now for you to look at it is this: everything is perfect unto itself because everything is only itself. There can be no consciousness outside of the total identity of a state of awareness or a beingness. Okay? The zebra does not suffer pain in regard to its own identity. It is constructed within its limited framework of memory to the configuration of its establishment in duality. Finally, since you have 1% within your genetic code that is at variance with a chimpanzee, you are not a chimpanzee. Okay? The chimpanzee knows perfectly well what it is. It does not construct death in its mind. Okay? It does not bury its dead with artifices to sustain it in its journey in consciousness. The thought has not occurred to it, but it has occurred to you. This engenders then great fear in you, doesn't it? Because apparently obliviation is God. So actually what you do is construct a method of coming to God or truth through death. Wow, what a strange thing to do. As a Christ, as an awakening consciousness, you will come into this chaos and present the limited state with the inevitability of recognition that there is no death, there is no termination, there is no obliviation. That consciousness individually, in its own consort of apparent reality, will always be in the state that it finds itself at this moment. Wow. In actuality, most consciousnesses are not afraid of death, for they have constructed it as an escape from life, which they are indeed deadly afraid of. We have come to discover that eternity is not a long time, but only this moment when we share our truth in love and in joy and happiness. We'll have just a little quiet time. When it's sleepy time down the sun. Be very gentle now.
Oh.
That's very lovely.